Good afternoon and welcome to all of you. I know for some of you it's your very first Dean Speaker Series. Many of you have been to a few before. This is our highest profile series. As you know, I'm Rich Lyons, Dean of the Haas School here. And we have an absolutely terrific speaker here. I'll introduce her in just a moment. We will keep this session, as we do our other Dean Speaker Series sessions, focused on leadership. Different of our guests come at that topic from different angles, which you would expect. And we will definitely have that here today. We have a Dean Speaker Series DSS page on the website if you want to look at some of the upcoming topics. We've got a lot of great people and topics coming up. So this is literally a Silicon Valley superstar that we have here today. So Debby Hopkins is one of these people who just serially questions the status quo, if I may use that phrase, and she does it to great effect and in many different ways. Of course, she is currently CEO of Citi Ventures and the Chief Innovation Officer for all of Citibank. And I think I'll give you a little bit of background. Let me just thank you for being here today, Debby. We appreciate it. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you. So just a little bit on Debby's background, and then we'll jump right in here. She joined Citi in 2003 as head of corporate strategy and M&A. Chief Operations and Technology Officer was a role that she's had at Citi. She, during her tenure, co-founded an initiative called Citi Women and played a significant role in the development of programs for high-potential women at Citi.
And you know who's doing that now?
Tell me. Barbara DeSore, our own Barbara DeSore, the CEO of Citibank. So that's a great program, and many other initiatives that Citi Ventures, in fact, was founded in Silicon Valley, and Debby was tapped to lead that new organization. That was 2010. When we think about Citi Ventures and what they're doing, and we'll get into this in more detail, but when we think about what is the overall growth strategy of an enormously important institution like a Citi, and that's really what they're focused on. How do you bring a startup mentality into a large enterprise like that? This is an age-old challenge, and it's still very real. The topic today, innovation through discovery, we will get to. She has been listed in many different publications. For example, in Fortune, top 10 most powerful women in business. She's been an institutional investor top 50 every year since 2011. Her accolades go on and on. She is also formally on our faculty here. So it was several years back, or maybe it was just a year back, that we finally got you to say yes to this. But we have what we call executive fellows, and Debby is one of our executive fellows here at the Haas School. So she acts as an advisor to me and other leaders of the school. She connects to our faculty, staff, and students in various ways. There's more on what executive fellows do on our website. So she announced not long ago that she will retire from Citi at the end of 2016. She will, of course, not retire in the grand sense, but from Citi, and she will be launching her own advisory firm. She will be getting more involved in boards, and there are a number of other elements like women's initiatives that she will be getting more involved in. So we look forward to hearing more about that. We're fortunate and grateful to have you here. Thank you again very much, Debby.
My
we
pleasure.
appreciate it.
Yeah.
So let me kick off with that big question, right? You've got this enormously important institution. You know it well. You've been there for a long time. It wants to grow differently and faster and innovate and all those things. And so what got you started on that path at Citi? What made you realize that this was something that you really wanted to do?
You know, it's an interesting thing. It found me, and the story actually is one of these great stories of why your network's so important. When I ran operations and technology, I got to know Sam Palmisano, who was the CEO of IBM at the time. And when there was a change in CEOs, and Vikram Pandit was CEO, and they were trying to say, okay, what are the things we need to focus on? They agreed one of them was innovation, and they were talking to Sam, and they said, and he said, go find Debby.
Ah.
So we always have that little joke that was a great thing. And the reality was, it was, at the time, there really weren't chief innovation officers in companies. We pushed that as a concept. The only tricky part was about 4 months later, the whole financial crisis happened.
Yep.
And so basically we were not out there being very prolific about things, but we were very active in Asia, really doing smart banking and some pretty interesting, very involved in mobile payments early on and doing all sorts of testing. But it was through coming out to Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
And 7 years ago, right now, was standing in a parking lot at Kleiner Perkins on a beautiful fall day and said, this is crazy. You can't be a tourist in the valley. You need to be part of this ecosystem. It's so completely different than how business operates. We need to be here. And so I actually came out by myself and built Citi Ventures from scratch in Palo Alto. And just a few months ago, we've opened up our flagship space in one market in San Francisco. Because an awful lot of things are heading north. And
North
even
and
more
east even a little bit.
I was just going to say that. Berkeley,
Yeah, I've noticed.
Oakland,
I've noticed.
it's like happening, man.
It's good stuff. Well, and so when also, I mean, when you think about what specific elements, I mean, I know you think about the learning and development function. You've thought deeply about, say a few things about the change management part of what you do. How do you get people to notice, realize?
You know, I think the thing that we're all going through, and if you haven't read, I know everybody tells you books to read, and you probably have no time to read any books, but it's worth it. Steve Case's new book, The Third Wave, is pretty darn interesting. I think he tells the story very, very well. But it's this whole concept where we're going from old economy to new economy, and the changes of that are so pervasive and so significant and so sharp and fast that it really defies any of the old structures of how we do work. So if you even just think of the basic structure of Alfred P. Sloan's, I worked there too, at General Motors, corporate structure, this vertical hierarchical power-based system is an ineffective model in a world where there is no predictability, chaos is rampant, and our biggest challenge is how do we create a network that is highly adaptable. So it's almost biologically adaptable, which is so completely different than how companies have really thrived for 100 years, let's say, in some cases like ours, 200 years. So when you get in touch with how radically profound that is, you have to think about how do you help people step into that. And frankly, when you've been a very successful individual and you've had your way of making things happen, you're an expert, let's say, in the field of payments, and it's a little hard to think like, well, we're a really large company, we're number one in this or number two in that. How big of a deal can all this entrepreneurship be to something like a city? And it turns out, of course, a very big deal. But making that impactful is really this case of, and I was teasing the dean today, but it's a classic, is you got to answer 3 questions for people. You know, why do I care? In other words, why is this possibly relevant? What's in it for me? And then really, how do I fit in? How can I play? Because people are intimidated by all this, I'm not Steve Jobs. Well, you don't need to be.
So let's pretend that I'm a senior executive at Citibank. I'm skeptical. Scare me. What 3 things would you say? Because many of these people know banking well, but not all of them know your industry as well.
That the cumulative market cap of fintech startups is the equivalent of cities.
Yikes. True? Wow.
True.
That's scary. Anything else?
That in 2001, the top 5 market cap companies in the Fortune 500 list were GE, Citi, all these typical large corporate oil and gas companies. And in 2016, they're all technology startups, completely off the list. So all the classic stalwart, captains of industry companies are off. What's interesting is, who's still in there though? It's Microsoft. And I think and they were off the list in 2011. So it was a 5-year increments going back to we can share the chart. I just thought it was fascinating. And I think there's an interesting resurgence going on there. But that is a profound level of change.
No question
that could
about it.
argue that it isn't technology per se that is the change. In my view, it was the combination of social, mobile, and really user experience. And that is the thing that is, I think, upended things in the most profound way.
In industry after industry, right?
Just completely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a new language. It's a new way of releasing products. It's this whole thing about testing and really doing rapid prototyping and MVPs, and it's like a whole nother language to people. But we shifted the power from a big corporation telling you, here's how you think about us, to the customer saying, excuse me,
right.
I have this, and I'm going to tell you what I think. And that is a whole different set of skills. So we need to, my view always is, we have 200 years of knowledge that nobody could touch. We've been in India over 100 years, China over 100 years. We know all the, government officials. We've been in all these core businesses from over a 200-year period. Can't match that.
Yeah.
However,
how do we bring that? Yeah.
However, we need to completely recast that knowledge, both in institutional businesses, commercial business, and consumer businesses, in ways that are relevant to today's customer. And it used to be, you'd say, well, there's consumer customers and there's institutional customers, and they're very, very different. They're not anymore. The treasurer of Boeing has the same interest as a consumer customer on how they want to be approached and how they want to do business, and they want to be able to do big transactions on their phone.
Wonderful.
So we've never seen that before. It's fundamental.
Yeah.
So it means, in our pitch to our teams, we need new skills, a lot of them, social, mobile, UX, and we need very different ways of working.
Yeah. And I like you framed the 200 years as an advantage and as an asset, and it certainly is, right? But one could also think of age in this rapidly, company age in this rapidly changing economy as a potential disadvantage. But do you think, in the sense that it just makes it a little harder to change a lot of things, but you think of it as a net advantage, or at least one that needs to be exploited more fully?
I think it's a net advantage for sure if you can be really, really fast at grasping this need to have new ways of working and to recognize the learning that has been so extraordinary coming out of, and up to this point in many ways, right from this part of the world. And I think that's the part that increasingly it's going to be a lot more about partnerships, by the way. We've just been through this wave of, fintech's going to take over everything. Not so quick. And they're all figuring that out too as we watch the recognition of the need to partner.
Yeah.
But the openness, it's mindset that's the game changer. It's the mindset of not saying, well, we've been here 200 years and none of you guys could touch our scale. It's, wow, there's a lot to learn, and we really increasingly as leaders have to be insatiably curious about a very different world. I mean, increasingly I find myself studying biology. There's so much going on in this whole cellular way the world is happening. It's kind of fascinating. It's the hot new thing to be. That or a behavioral economist.
Yes.
Are the other hot topics, right? So mindset turns out to be the most important thing that makes anything for all of us work. The mindset, why you're here at Haas, because you have a mindset that this rigor of learning and this exposure will significantly change my chances to following my dreams. I agree with that, by the way. But that is your mindset. So I'm curious, I'm open, I'm thinking. So if we can bring that mindset into large organizations, we truly will make the world a better place. And that's what Eric Ries and Steve Blank have done in the Lean Startup. Taking, back when I was in automotive, we had lean manufacturing. So the concept of lean isn't new.
It's been around, yeah.
But the concept of bringing entrepreneurship and the skills of it and the mindset of it is true. But the speed is the critical issue, which is when the guys at PayPal are the first to say, we didn't have any definition of what failure looked like. We weren't burdened by, well, we've always done it this way. So you have to find different approaches, which is some of the things we're working on with our businesses, that can give you space to think without well, we tried that before, or this doesn't work, or compliance won't let us. Well, yeah, we got to go work with them. So it's because the other side of, and I think Steve Case covers this very well in his book, is policy is going to come rearing back into the world because our regulators are desperately working on how do you play catch-up ball with regulations that make sense in a broader sense of what business is about.
Yeah, super important. And I love the phrase you mentioned, insatiably curious, as you've heard before. I mean, we have a phrase that we use, students always, but that notion of mindset, of being that absorptive, that open, right? And these are not easy to measure things, but wouldn't it be interesting if we actually had a gauge where we could say, mindset, don't want that person. Mindset, oh yeah, we want this person. Right.
It's like the Harry Potter thing.
Well, in some ways, it's what we're interviewing for, right? At some level, right? It's kind of, and it's always hard to pin down, but that's why the way we develop these techniques for evaluating people. Let me go back to fintech for just a little bit, right? Because you know what that means, and I have some sense for what that means, being a finance faculty member. But let's just give me 2 or 3 fintech developments that could disrupt a Citibank in 10 or 15 years?
I'm not sure it's per se fintech, but it is coming to fintech in very, very big ways, and that's blockchain.
Blockchain.
The blockchain, depending on who you're talking to.
Okay.
Some people, one way or the other. And it was a really interesting thing because how that came known to people was really through the craziness of Bitcoin,
sure.
which was an unfortunate example of some not so great players riding on top of technology called blockchain. But the technology is a complete game changer.
Yeah.
I mean, absolutely, fundamentally complete game changer. And, at first to a lot of people, one of the things we talk about is the lenses that we all look at people through. And we could go off on the election and then we would be here all day about these lenses that are going on at the moment. But if you looked at blockchain through the lens of what you saw these kind of bad players in Bitcoin, you say, why would I care? And our point early on was that would be a mistake. What you really wanted, it's the underlying technology. So a distributed, digital ledger that can remove a very antiquated settlement process, that changes the game.
That's major.
If you can have a way of connecting people where they're assured of who's on each side of a transaction, that changes the game.
Yeah.
So it's a place where, now, that's not going to get implemented overnight. So we're invested in Chain, for example, chain.com. So we're deeply in our work that we do on my team on driving a portfolio of experiments and technologies. We're deeply experimenting, and that's the key, is just starting to understand the use cases, not because you're going to immediately implement it, but to validate, another new term out of lean startup, is there a there?
Yeah.
And there is a big there.
That's really interesting. Well, because the tech, most of us have read just a little bit about Bitcoin and blockchain, but the idea that there could be a general ledger that we could all look at that would be secure, that could provide a record of all those transactions is a really remarkable thing. Right?
So the trusted intermediary.
So you might imagine that, look, if it's going to be secure, it can't be transparent, but maybe not. And if it's going to, so the potential properties of this really are remarkable. I'm glad you used. And then
no, it's a really great one. I think
that's a great one. Hey, let's switch gears just a little bit, and I know you're going to have some questions. I want the students to jump in.
By the way, so.
Let me ask one more important, easy question, and that is, the women's initiatives at Citi, and so. What have you learned in sort of pushing that forward? Because we're getting better.
It's God's work is part of the thing I've learned. And how many of you have been to Hamilton? Oh, my goodness, we have to rectify this. This is coming to San Francisco.
Yep.
By the way, have you seen it?
I've heard the soundtrack many times, but I have not seen it.
This is one of the most profound things you will ever see. It is so phenomenal. And this guy is a genius.
Yeah.
Entrepreneur.
Yeah.
Unbelievable genius. And Lin-Manuel Miranda. And you've got to go see it because he's got young kids paying attention to history.
Yeah.
And the way he's done that. But we have this thing on our team where I use a lot of the phrases because I happen to be one of your other graduates works for me.
Yes.
She will attest to the
Yes.
fact that I'm obsessed with theater, but when it comes to Hamilton, everything stops and the songs start. But there's this wonderful phrase that he put into the show that I want to be in the room where it happens. Of course you do. You do want to be in the room where it happens. And that has in many ways been the challenge of women's initiatives. That you can work really hard on hiring great women. You can work really hard on, it used to be, we talked about mentoring, which I really am not convinced is a very effective methodology. The program that we worked on that Barbara's now involved in that I thought was really important was the concept of advocacy. Not a member, but you need somebody in the room where it happens that says, why isn't Tanya the right person for that role? And I think that's the trickiest part because we are really all very comfortable around people who are like us, unless we've been lucky enough to really be steeped in diversity and of thought, of culture, of many components that made it better. Yeah. Right. So when you hanging out with the guys who went to the same school you did, the guys who play the same golf that you do, it's a comfort thing. Yeah. And the world is not comfortable. We can't be comfortable anymore. It won't work. We have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, frankly, and recognizing in all of that is always opportunity.
I love that. Can't be comfortable anymore.
It's gone.
Look, I think it's an important point. And back on your mentoring point. So I introduced you to Jo Mackness, and she's the chief strategy officer.
She looks like right now she's like gearing up for a big run.
She's going for a run, and Jo is absolutely terrific, right? And she's part of the senior team around here, and she just went through one of the great UC leadership programs. And then she came back to me, and we had talked a bit about what she was learning, but she had this list, and she said, here's the list of people that I've identified in the program as mentors, and here's the list of people I've identified in the program as my advocates. And Rich, those two categories are different in these ways.
Exactly.
And you're I'm asking you to be one of my advocates, right? And so, the notion is, will you be there for me? Will you help champion me right? And that's a little different role.
When you most need it.
But so she coached me in sort of saying, there are two categories here, here's the difference, and you're listed. And it was really useful for me, right? For her to have coached me sort of in, I'd like to think I'd been serving as a mentor, but this idea of advocate was great. So anyways, that was a good click in my thinking, right? Yeah.
That's how our brains work.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing is, and there's a lot of people with different opinions on this, is that women need to be way better at helping other women.
Yes.
And Tanya actually helped me with this. I'm an influencer on LinkedIn, and I wanted to write a post called Mean Girls, and I actually was convinced this was going to be one of the biggest posts I'd ever done, and it actually didn't get that big of a response. And I'm convinced it's because people didn't want to be seen as being on one side of the story or another. By far our biggest post is probably still the surfing, why innovation is like surfing. But it is a really interesting fact that sometimes when a woman will become a senior person in an organization, they think somehow there's only room for one. And so if I promote somebody else, then I won't be standing out so much. It can't work like that. It just can't work like that. And I think when I was writing this post, she went to your undergrad school, right? Madeleine Albright was, famous for saying there's a special place in hell for women who don't help other women. And I went to this event in San Francisco, and there's Madeleine Albright. So I went up to her, and I said, hey, I'm writing this post. And Neat. She was delightful, amazing woman. And she said, it turns out that's the most important thing I've ever said. Wow. I said, Madeleine, come on. Wow. You've been in the middle. You've got your pins. I've seen the whole, heard the whole pin story. And you've kind of given the finger to a few interesting people.
Yes,
so,
yes.
So no, really, it's been the most important thing I ever said. Wow. And she said, I can't tell you how mean other women were to me when I was coming up through the diplomatic corps.
Wow.
And I said, hey, I've been through it too. And I think it's really important, I guess, increasingly in this world of discomfort and unpredictability and so many other components, and maybe it's my age, loyalty is the core, is really being loyal to the people who got you where you are, the people who've helped you, and to those behind you that you need to pull along. And I think that's a super important thing to remember is really, and that's why I love working with young people so much, as you know, because I think there's so much opportunity, and we have to do, it's so easy for me to say, oh, let me connect you to someone. It takes me 2 seconds. So it's not a big deal, but I think we have to understand it's our responsibility. And really in some of the kind of situations that, you do this all the time, right? I mean, how hard is that?
Well, look, there's a mindset there that everybody needs to get better at, including me, including us. But I think, that's what makes great managers and leaders, right? If people feel like you're not just managing them, you're managing their careers, you're right? That's a totally different kind of a manager, right? It's harder to quit that manager than one who's just, you're managing you. Hey, let's open it up. I'd like you to use the microphone, and if you want to line up behind it, we want to capture this for our video room. For those of you that this is the First Dean Speaker Series, we capture all this content.
And we are writing down who stands up and who doesn't. So
and we have that information
will go
as
on
well.
your evaluation.
So put your mindset on display and give us a question. Who's going to kick us off? Thanks. Come on up. Yep.
Extra credit points.
That's it, right there.
Hi, how are you? Thank
Good.
you so much for taking the time to come out. So my name is Camilo. I'm an undergraduate here at Berkeley Haas. And my question is, often what happens in large corporations like Citi is that the corporate venture capital arms, like Citi Ventures, are often sideload from the rest of the business. How have you and Citi Ventures addressed that specifically?
I did not plant this question, but it's a great question. Thank you very much. It turns out we don't just equity invest, and that was one of the fun things as being the founder of Citi Ventures, designed from the beginning. So we really drive 3 portfolios. One is venture investing. The second component is a portfolio of internal experiments on technologies, like blockchain. So working with the labs in our businesses, they don't report to us, but we created this fabric connecting them called the Lab Network. And so we work very actively with our businesses to agree on a set of strategic areas, like digital authentication is another one of those portfolios. And then the third portfolio are now internal startups that we're driving off of the lean startup technology, where we're driving growth boards, like emulating a venture capital firm, with our businesses being the heads of those growth boards. So to me, and all of the companies we invest in, we bring into our businesses. And that's a winning hand both for our portfolio companies and for our businesses, because the whole idea is how do we accelerate time to market? So if we can help a startup scale, we've made their day. So we really have a multifaceted approach, and it's all under one roof, and it all works together and informs each other.
It's great. Super question.
Thank you very much.
Siloing doesn't work, so your question is right on, by the way.
It's really helpful. Really helpful perspective. And to make sure that those internal startups, the third piece, do not get suffocated. I'm sure you've developed some mechanisms.
It's really cool. It's really by creating this environment which we call Discover 10X, and D10X for short, and really where people in the business can put forward a concept and pitch to come in, just like you come into a venture capital room. You got 7 minutes to make your case about why it's important, why it's relevant. And then there's an opportunity for somebody to get a little bit of seed funding. And I mean in a corporate term, a little bit. Typically, corporations overfund things. They get all excited about a new thing and you put too much money on it, and it won't be successful with too much. It sounds funny, but it's true. It's why venture capital works, because there's a thirst. I need to get my next round from the VC, so I've got to validate and demonstrate that I got something real here. That's the secret sauce that we're talking about, is because customers universally have changed so much and the needs are changing so quickly, you cannot assume that you know what they want. You have to be constantly validating. So our program is creating a transparent portfolio in one view for our CEO can see all of the startups and what stage
Neat.
they're in,
Neat.
and things that are getting closer to going to market.
Mm-hmm.
But we've created a whole mindset approach, and so instead of us, Citi Ventures, running it, we're coaching the teams, and we work with a third party who's Bionic, who's come in and helped us kind of drive this with the businesses. But the trick is helping the businesses feel the ownership, and at the same time keeping what we call the truth in the room, not falling back into kind of old ways of looking at things, and the recognition that costs very little, so capital efficient, costs very little money to go after validating something, and in many cases it costs nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So this validation process has been kind of core to get at commercial truth.
That's terrific.
Instead of assuming, well, I know what they want, and the reality is you just can't anymore. It's just changing too quickly.
Yeah, well, there's fundamental insights, and some of you have seen some of this in your classes. But if you're a first year here or a junior in the undergraduate program, this idea of lean entrepreneurship, right? It's sort of like test your assumptions, right? Run a bunch of experiments, validate. It's the scientific method in the commercial world, right? That's really what it is. But it's a radically different way of teaching and doing entrepreneurship.
And turns out of learning. What happens because the other secret to the portfolio is that you're taking enough calculated bets. So you've got volume, and what we're witnessing is the learning, first of all, teaching them to fail, which inside a corporation you never fail, or at least you never admit failing. But this is obviously the concept of failing very quickly. But it's the accumulated learning from these teams going through things, and then you get a breakthrough. Then which is exactly how a startup works, right?
Yeah.
But a new way of learning by doing, versus, this is the way we've always done things, or, sitting in some meeting where people are enlightening you about ways of thinking.
Yeah.
Doing is how we learn.
Excellent. I love it. Another question, please, in front here. Yep, thanks.
Hi, thank you so
I
much.
like the
for your
matching
talk.
shoes, and that's like
Thank you.
happening. Maybe you better go on that run tonight. You could lead.
I'm Sahinas. I'm a full-time MBA graduating in 2018. So my question for you is that I know that there is a lot of differences between men and women, and we want both of them in the room to achieve certain things. There is a lot of different sets of skills that diversity brings to us. I wanted to ask you, what are some skills that you think as a woman you brought to table?
I think, it's always hard to kind of pigeonhole people, but this networking, creating impact through influence versus positional power, I think is increasingly the way things have to get done. And because I think that hierarchy, we can't, because of the time the hierarchy takes, nobody can afford that anymore. So it's really creating more of that ability to create impact without necessarily having people reporting to you. I think the other skill is really trying to paint an optimistic view of the future, and then recognizing, which it took me a while to figure out, is that's good, but you then have to build the stair steps to help people see the way towards that view of the future is really, I think, critical. And, I think I always get a little concerned about us kind of generalizing women versus men. I think women tend to be a lot more pragmatic. And I think it's often because we juggle so many things with kids and so forth. But it's just like, let's figure it out. Let's go. But you need all skills in a room, as you're saying. And the biggest problems I've ever solved is by having a cross-organizational teams in a room. And it's not with senior people. It's with people that are closest to a problem who can often, and then have the courage to speak up. And I think the other thing I've always done is spoke up on behalf of the underdog.
Thank you.
Interesting.
You're welcome.
Interesting. And just come on up for the next question. But that underdog, is it in part because that's a fresh perspective, in part it's just the right thing to do, little of both?
I think it's a lot of both, and I think it's really often it is that person who is off-piste, but they're on to something.
I see.
You know, are we being curious enough? Maybe they're saying it awkwardly or whatever, but are they being curious enough about? Are we listening enough? Because they're saying it in a different language or in a different way of bringing it forward, and I think that's really important. That's how we learn.
I love it. Thank you. Please.
Thank you for your time today. My name is Mahima. I'm part of the Evening Weekend MBA here, graduating next year. My question is, you mentioned that 5 years ago, the Chief Innovation Officer title didn't even exist. So you were trying to come into an organization that has been around for 200 years and trying to do something new. And I'm trying something similar in my team. I work for Moody's. I'm a product manager.
Oh, great.
What were some of the short-term things that really help change people's mindset when you're trying to infuse innovation?
And I had been at the organization when I took the role, which in some ways is harder. And really, because we always tend to give more credit to third parties than we do with the people who we work with all the time. But I think a lot of this, it was the move to the Valley and bringing this very, very different view into the room. And I was, speaking to Dean Lyons earlier, and when you're sitting in New York, when you're in a very big company, it's not just Citi, but any big company, you have this feeling like, well, we have a card, and I'm an EVP, and I can get a meeting anywhere. And not so much in the way it works out here. It's a very, very different way of working. And that ability to really infuse that in a way that was relevant to the challenges of running a business was really important. And we found what was important to that is doing it as a group. So we brought our most senior executives out and allowed them to experience it firsthand. They learned by doing. We put them on a bus. We took them down to Intuit. We went to Google. We went all over the place. And then we really created content to say, why is that relevant? So it is really trying to get in how can you bring forward a concept that has enough insight to them that's like, okay, I need to make time to listen to this. Because, when you're running a business, it's brutal. When you're, and having been CFO of a couple big companies, when you're doing that, you're like on every day. Like, how am I going to do it? I got the analysts coming up. I got this. It's very hard to make time.
And sorry to interrupt, but you made that very clear that you needed that, right?
Yeah.
You basically said, if I'm going to do this job,
I need you guys out here.
I need this to happen.
I want you to see it firsthand. And it was great because we were, because of our, first of all, it made it very clear that we've created a unique network out here. We have a network of very interesting startups, of high profile people in the Valley that they had heard of but not seen and experienced firsthand. And there's nothing like bringing Mark Andreessen in the room and start explaining why you really don't get it, guys, because software is eating the world, and let me explain to you what I mean. And it's extraordinary. We went down to see Scott Cook at Intuit, very, very different personality, but all about don't waste your money on voice of the customer. You got to worry about what they do, how they behave. Hence, what's becoming really fascinating is how important behavioral economists are to the world you live in. So it's how do you make it relevant? How do you make it count? And I think it's always a mixture of, wow, all this is happening, anxiety, and we can do this, creative confidence. That's how you make change happen. You've got to bring those two things together.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Please go ahead, yeah.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Thomas. I'm also from the full-time MBA, graduating in 2018. My question to you would be in the realm of fintech, which is really big at the moment, especially in the banking area and asset management. There's a few fintechs that are providing in asset management like innovative solutions. but they're still relatively small in terms of the asset managed.
So give me some names that you're excited about.
Like EO Money, I don't know if you've heard of that.
Yeah, yes.
And when I worked in asset management, the banks were not too concerned by it because they said, okay, they're really, really small. And so even though you've got an innovative solution that might be really good for the customer, it's really hard to convince them to change from the big banks. So at working for Citi, how would you advise entrepreneurs who work in fintech to really steal those customers away from the big banks in fintech, even when you've got like something very
I might
innovative?
phrase it a teeny bit differently, but we invest in those startups, by the way. We're invested in Betterment, which has been, we're invested in Chain. We've done a fair amount of partnering with SoFi. In fact, we brought Mike Cagney in to one of, not this year's summit, but last year's summit. And he did a really good job of freaking people out. I mean, he was amazing because he is, they started out in student lending, where it's easy to say, well, we don't do student lending. I said, yeah, but see, these guys morph. He's just starting there, right? And when they came back the next year, oh, wow, it's like a whole different story. And now he's going into mortgage. And oh, by the way, asset management. So, but what was so profound is his deep understanding, coming out of Wells Fargo. He understands banking. Mm-hmm. He knows how it works. Mm-hmm. He knows the consumer side. He knows the commercial side. This is one smart dude. So I have a lot of time for the guy. And he brought radical simplicity to the table. So you can't avoid not stepping into what we call stepping into disruption and embracing even the potential of partnering with some of these startups, because the radical simplicity is a necessity of where the world is going. And really abstracting the underlying challenges of what it takes to make all those things happen is core. So, it's really complicated what Google does, and none of us think about it. We just type in what we want to know, right? Well, the same thing has to happen. And it turns out that's particularly important in financial services because we've managed to, I think, as a society, really made people very uncomfortable about money. And we have to make that a core operating system inside of all of you as students. And really starting at a very young age to feel like that's something you're comfortable with and understand. And radical simplicity and some of the work that companies like that are doing, to me, is critical. So that's why we say we're champion of the entrepreneur, and we're very interested in investing in companies like that. And I think in many ways you'll increasingly find more partnerships going on and allowing banks to really embrace, we need to offer that as a capability to give confidence to our customers. Because your generation judges the quality of what we do by how well our software works. Not a bad idea when it comes down to it, because it takes solid strategic thinking to make great software. And we need a different way of offering things. So I think there's so much to learn. The learning is what I get super excited about, because they don't have the scale, and they can learn a great deal working with us. And likewise, and everybody wins out of that, in my opinion. So I think it's a really interesting time, and I think this next couple of years there'll be some pretty significant changes going on. But Mike's now worth $4 billion, SoFi. When we first started talking about it, it was like $400 million. So the escalation of value is extraordinary. And of course, something interesting happened at Lending Club. But that whole ability to radically simplify lending, it's a big deal. Used to be an intimidating thing to do. Yeah. There's no room for that in the world we're living in. So, to me, we have to find more places where we come together and just have complete, profound respect for these people that are really going after this from a very user-centric view.
That's great. Thank you very much. Other questions, thoughts? Please go for it. Yeah.
Hi, so my name is Chinmay, also first year MBA student here. So continuing on the fintech topic, as an entrepreneur, what do you see are the advantages of going to, to Citi Ventures over the typical VCs like Kleiner Perkins that you mentioned, or what are the pros and cons around that when, as an entrepreneur in the fintech space, you're looking to raise, a round of money?
Well, I think there's room for both. So I really get teased by my family that I've become a liberal now that I live in California, but I'm not a fan of excluding anybody. And I do think there is room for both, and I think that's where things come together. The key thing is we are domain experts at what we do. Mm-hmm. So we really deeply understand the domains, and that ability to help a startup commercialize is really a huge deal. And that's very difficult to do. We call it, we're the Sherpas. So if we believe in somebody and we take them up the mountain, we introduce them at the right place. Typically a startup will be running around the outside getting bounced back to junior of a space, instead of trying to make a case at the right place in the organization. Should think about doing a proof of concept here. Just even if that doesn't result in a commercialization, the learning for both the company and the startup is extraordinary. And we watch this happen all the time. And I think there's a great deal to do there. I have huge respect for, Andreessen Horowitz and Sequoia and the businesses they have built, and they have a lot of capital to invest, and they can be hugely helpful, and they're very good at driving the discipline for entrepreneurship and keeping that very, very strong. So I would say you need both. I would.
Thanks for that. So we're getting short on time. I'm going to ask the last question, if I may, and it's going to be another one of these very broad questions. But the age-old question of leaders.
I don't like age anymore.
Okay,
so I'm getting sensitive.
And leaders born versus made. And at some level, the best business schools, these are all such capable people. The finance, the strategy, the accounting, those are table stakes, right? These people are going to get their best work done in their lives by working through and with other people, right? And we can call that leadership. We can call it what we want. So, part of our task is to accelerate their development as leaders as possible. So, could you talk a little bit about kind of built leaders? How do you think about that? How to do it?
Yeah, I think the opportunity for all of you is, lines are blurring between industries. There's no definition. When I remember interviewing at Ford, where I worked out of school, and you're going to have this job, and then you'll have that job, and there was this really hierarchy of the jobs you needed to do. I mean, those days are over, and I have been in 5 industries, which is unusual for somebody of my vintage. And see, it's starting to really creep me out. I like, how did this ever happen? But I am so grateful for those experiences. And with the exception of financial services, I have always been in engineering and manufacturing business. So I've been in automotive, in aerospace, and computers, and telecommunications. And what's fascinating about those 4 is it taught me systems thinking, which is a very, very different skill in a services business. And it's critically important to the future of everything we're doing right now. So I believe it's experience. Yes, there are some people that are gifts. I've worked with some people who are phenomenally brilliant, but have no common sense, right? And it is the common sense that will save you when you're in trouble. And diversity, I've had some crushing, bone-killing, defying moments of defeat and diversity, adversity, that they are absolutely the biggest teachers. And so you can't avoid that, or don't avoid it, because it is the teaching of, okay, why did that happen?
Yeah.
What didn't I do? And how am I going to make sure I don't do it again? But it's the learning. So, experience as many things as you can, because I think it's leadership is, you and I've talked about this before, is, oh, I like the way so-and-so does that, but boy, and it's creating your own kind of style, right? And
Yeah.
you have to find what works for you because you have to be authentically you. You can't be somebody other than you and be successful at it for very long. So I think the more exposure, I've always been a huge believer, always put your hand up on a special project and get exposed to as many different kinds of doing things because the thing, and you and I've talked about this as well, that I have a really hard time with is that we love to pigeonhole people. You're a finance person, you're a marketing person. Yeah. No, that just kind of happens. Like what I did doesn't mean that's who I am. And we all have these secret skills inside of us. And your job is to find those.
That's nice.
To find those skills, like what is it you really do? Not that you're a great finance person. Okay, you've got that skill, but there's a secret skill, and everybody's got at least one, if not several, that are going to guide you and can be your greatest asset. But we don't help people find those.
Yeah, it's great. Look, that's a super important comment. In one of our programs, we had a speaker in our orientation week, Nikita Mitchell, and she talked about the pressure of becoming one thing and how she had to be conscious of it and think about it and make sure that she wasn't slipping too much into that. You've said so many things today, Debbie. I took a number of notes. I'm just going to repeat a few because they're nuggets, right? They're kernels here that express a lot more than just the words in and of themselves. But I love the phrase, you can't be a tourist in the valley, right? I mean, what that really means. What does it mean when you get what's going on there, right? I want to be in the room where it happens. You talked about Hamilton. Keeping the truth in the room is an important concept, right? Confronting the truth and knowing when you're letting it leave the room. And we can't be comfortable anymore. Debby Hopkins, thank you so much for this.
Pleasure.